All right, it's time for our September Money Minute Roundup. Here's what's coming your way today. The Federal Reserve cuts interest rates by 0.5%. We're going to look at how common your birthday is, what Americans think you need in order to be wealthy. US median income rose to over $80,000 for the first time in history, and iPhone photography award winners. That's all coming up on today's episode of the Money Minute.
Welcome to the Financial Pathway Podcast. We're here to help you go to the next level in your finances with practical advice from speaker and financial planner Nate Skelly.
So we're going to start with probably the biggest story from this month, which is that the Federal Reserve lowered interest rates, and not by 0.25%, which a lot of people thought was going to happen a few months ago, but by 0.5%. So larger jump than normal. Usually they lower it or raise it by 0.25% at a time. But of course, in times where they feel they need to accelerate interest rate movements, they will do it by 0.5% or more. Now, what does that all mean, and how does that affect us, and what does it mean for the average American? Well, first of all, just so we're all clear, the reason that the Federal Reserve cuts or raises interest rates is in order to help the economy and particularly to keep inflation in check. So what happened was after COVID, we had a big spike in inflation. Prices rose considerably, and in response to that, the Federal Reserve rose their interest rates. The Federal Reserve is the central bank in the United States. They lend out money to other large banks, and then those banks lend money to us. And if the Federal Reserve changes their interest rates, then the other big banks will change their interest rates for how they lend out money to other people accordingly. So the Federal Reserve really has kind of their thumb on the scale and is able to set interest rates for the entire country because all the banks basically borrow from them. And their stated purpose is to keep inflation running at about 2%. So you say, well, how does that affect inflation? Well, basically what it comes down to is this. If you lower interest rates, that makes it easier for people to borrow. If it's easier to borrow, more people will borrow, and there will be more money injected into the economy, but that leads to a larger money supply. And when the money supply gets larger, that can lead to inflation. More money in the system means that things become devalued and prices rise. So you don't want interest rates to be too low and there to be too much money, because that's going to lead to inflation and things will get crazy in a hurry. But on the flip side, you don't want to say, oh, well, let's just keep interest rates really, really high, because if you do that, then it makes it hard for people to borrow. And when it's hard for people to borrow, people won't get mortgages, people won't invest in new businesses, and the economy will stagnate, and then that will lead to a recession. So as I've talked about before on the podcast, the Federal Reserve, it's almost like the interest rates are them on the grill, and they're trying to keep the temperature just right. And they're flipping those burgers and moving them to different spots on the grill. They're trying to lower or raise interest rates to keep the economy humming at a good rate. And the key thing that they're looking at is, where is inflation? So a few years ago, inflation topped out at 9%. Here recently, it's come down to about 2.5%. So getting closer and closer, and they believe it's on trajectory to land at about 2%. So what they're trying to do is, now that it feels like we've got inflation under control, let's go ahead and lower the interest rates, because if we keep interest rates high for too long, then that will be bad too, because we'll stagnate the economy and it will lead to a recession. So again, how does this affect you and me? So like, okay, great, great explanation on economic policy, but what does that actually mean for a regular person? Well, mortgage rates, any loans, really, interest rates are going to fall accordingly. A lot of people have been struggling to buy a home. Home affordability has gotten way out of hand for a lot of people in the last 4 years. And I don't know about you, but as you look on Zillow and Realtor.com and you look at homes, and then you kind of do the calculator and you think, man, that is going to be that much of a payment, the payment's going to be that much on that house. By bringing interest rates a little bit lower, that's going to make affordability better. Will that lead to a rise in home prices? Potentially. But what we've seen is that the housing market across the board has been cooling here recently. So if anything, I think it's going to help to just sort of prop up and keep home prices more stagnant for the near term. But we'll see how that plays out. Mortgage rates have already lowered in response. But the other good news, I suppose, if you're a lender or if you're borrowing, is that it seems like the Federal Reserve is indicating that they plan to lower interest rates by another 0.5% by year's end, and then again a little bit in 2025. Now, that's what they're planning to do. That can change very, very quickly, as we've seen these last few years. Just because policymakers indicate that that's what they're planning to do does not mean that's always what happens. Now, on the downside, how does this also affect us? So if you're going to be borrowing money, it's good news. But if you've got money on the sidelines that you're keeping in bonds or CDs or high yield savings accounts, this is a little bit of bad news, because those also fluctuate with the interest rate environments. And if interest rates are falling, then what banks and lenders will pay out in interest to CDs, high yield savings, money market accounts, these types of things will also fall. So it goes hand in hand. There's always some good and some bad that comes along with this. But it's interesting that we've been looking at this for a while now, expecting rates to come down, and they kept getting pushed back. But finally, we've seen a drop here, and probably going to see some more drops here soon. Okay, second article that we want to look at is how common is your birthday? This is an interesting study. So there's a great visual here from Tableau Public, I think is how we say it. And it shows, and I didn't even realize this until looking at the data, apparently the most popular times for birthdays are like midsummer to early fall, which being a September 15th birthday, my birthday is the 9th most common day for birthdays, and September 9th is the most common. So if you're listening to this and your birthday is September 9th, congratulations, you are born on the most popular day of the year. The least popular days, this makes sense. Second least popular is New Year's Day. Least popular is Christmas. So I get that. So any family getting ready to give birth, if at all possible, they're going to try to avoid going to the hospital on Christmas. If somebody has to schedule inducement or anything along those lines, they're going to probably avoid doing that on Christmas Day. So anyway, if you want to see where your birthday ranks in order of popularity as far as the number of days, you can check that article out. Next one is what Americans think they need in order to be wealthy. So there's a new survey from Schwab where they ask people, how much money does it take in order to be considered wealthy? Not necessarily for yourself, but just in general, how much money would somebody have to have in order to be considered wealthy? Well, last year when they did the study, the average number came out at 2.2 million. It's up a bit this year. The new number is 2.5 million. So congratulations if your net worth is 2.5 million or greater. Apparently, you are wealthy. It's interesting because really, and I've looked at many different surveys that have asked similar questions. When you look at respondents by their net worth, generally what people will always say is wealthy is something above where I am. So people that have a net worth of 100,000 will say, oh, 1 million is wealthy. But people with $1 million net worth will say, oh, 5 million is wealthy. So you just kind of keep on pushing it, because nobody wants to kind of look at themselves as, oh, I'm so wealthy. They always want to try to downplay their status in that sense, or at least it seems like in public surveys that seems to be what happens. The median net worth in the United States is 193,000, or at least that was in 2022. So I'm sure it's a little bit higher today. That means if your net worth is below 193,000, you're in the bottom half. Above 193,000, you're in the top half. So in other words, most Americans, the vast majority of Americans, are well below that number of 2.5 million. But also what was interesting about this survey is that they also answered a question, not what would they consider wealthy, but how much would you need to live a financially comfortable life? And that number was much lower. The average was 778,000. So I guess the point in all of this is, what's interesting to me is it's all relative, right? You ask Americans, what do you need to be wealthy? What do you need to be comfortable? And we'll put a number that's pretty high relative to our standard of living. But if you ask that same question in plenty of other countries, I'm sure you get very, very different answers and probably a lot lower numbers. Or if you just backed up 50 or 60 years ago. So I think the lesson in all that is, no matter where you're at, you can always envision something a little bit better. And so it just kind of becomes that never-ending thing that you're chasing as far as, what does wealth exactly look like? What do I need to be comfortable? It'll always end up being something a little bit more than what you have now for most people. Now, on that same vein of income and wealth, another interesting article that came out this month showed that the U.S. median income rose to just over 80,610 in 2023. That's a decent jump from the last year, from 2022, the last year that we had data for, 4% increase. Now, it's good news and it's bad news. I mean, the good news, of course, is it's great to hear that median income is going up. That seems like a bullish sign for the economy. But when you consider that costs have also been rising dramatically in that same period of time, not as impressive. The cost of living from 2020 to today is about 20 to 25%. Across the board, it's a little bit different. It's a little bit difficult to gauge because it depends on your family size, depends on what part of the country you live in, depends on how much you commute, depends on how much you spend on groceries. So different things have risen at different levels. So depending on how much you utilize of various goods, the actual impact of inflation may be higher or lower, but it's somewhere in 20 to 25% across the board. So when you think about that, things cost that much more than they did a few years ago. Yes, it's great if you've been getting a cost of living increase. It's great if you're making a little bit more money, but really most of that purchasing power has been offset by that higher inflation. It'll be interesting to see if that trend continues going into 2024 as far as income and how far it jumps. The last few years have not had very many significant jumps. 2023, from 2022 to 2023 was actually the first year in a few years where it felt like a considerable jump of 4%. And then the last article for this week, not really much I can talk about, but it's the 17th annual iPhone Photography Award winners. I'm not going to try to explain or try to describe the pictures to you. I will say this, it's really amazing looking through the pictures though, just how the quality of the cameras that we have in our pockets, how we just take that for granted. I mean, I remember just the type of cameras 12, 13, 15 years ago and how they really pale in comparison. The things that you could have gotten at, any electronics store that would have been considered a very high-end camera would be way worse than what you've got in your pocket now. And just really cool to see how creative and clear some of the shots that people can take with iPhones are. So if you want to check that out, that's on the Money Minute email as well. And by the way, if you are not getting the Money Minute email, just shoot me a message, info@nateskelly.com, or you can always go to the website and fill out the form and subscribe there, and we'll get that in your monthly inbox. Well, that's going to do it for today. Thanks as always for listening. See you on the next